on record.
On record.
Call to order the Lincoln City Urban Renewal Agency of November 13th, 2017. Roll call, please.
Dick Anderson.
Yes.
Riley Hoagland.
Here.
Deanna Hinton. Here. Judy Casper. She's excused. Susan Walke.
Here.
Kip Ward.
Here.
And Mayor Williams.
Here.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is comments from citizens present. I see no one there. Next item is minutes of the meeting of October 23rd, 2017.
Move to approve minutes of October 23rd.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve the minutes of the Urban Renewal Agency regular meeting on October 23rd, 2017. Discussion? I submitted a couple of little typos, but nothing substantial. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes. Presentations, public hearings, public comment, none. Special order of business presentations. We have a property redevelopment consultant presentation. Ms. Robertson and Mr. Southgate.
While they're coming up, let me give you a little background in how we got to tonight, and then they can do all the heavy lifting. Over the last several months, Allison and I have discussed quite extensively on how to go forward with the properties that you have asked us to develop commercially. We've also had many discussions also about the residential properties as well, and those discussions centered around, do we try to accomplish this all in-house, or do we ask someone with experience to come and assist us in this? The farther along we got, the more research that Allison did, we felt that it would benefit the city to have the expertise that's already been established rather than us just trying to recreate that expertise. So Allison has been doing an awful lot of work and introduced me to Mr. John Southgate, who is a developer extraordinaire, to help us in this project. And so what we wanted to do today, this is just for a discussion, is to introduce him to you, explain a little bit about how we're going forward, and then during the city council meeting, we're also going to do the same thing but talking about the residential properties. So with that, I'll turn it over to them.
Good evening. I just wanted to do a quick introduction of Mr. Southgate, John. He comes from quite extensive background with development and revitalization. He used to work for Portland Development Commission, also as the City of Hillsborough Economic Development Director, and has done lots of different things, from pulling together partners for public, private, and institutional investment in downtowns to reviewing development codes and building partnerships with developers. He's worked for many different cities and counties across the state, even out of the state, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So I'm pleased to introduce him to you. And right now, I think what we'll do is just go through the properties, just to kind of refresh everyone's minds. And then John will walk through what we can expect for how we go forward, since this is new work for us. Okay. So the first property, remember there are 4 urban renewal owned properties, the first one being Northwest 15th Street in the Ocean Lake District. And this is a 100 by 100 lot. Pretty straightforward. We did a major street improvement a few years ago, and this one is just ready. It's the last property on the street that has not been developed. Here's what it looks like after we completed the street rebuild. The second property is Northeast First Street, otherwise known as Hostetler Park. And this property is 1.36 acres, but it also has some development hurdles in terms of easements, and being right on the water, there will be a few challenges in that respect. We did do a wetland delineation, which is now under review at DEQ. So we're trying to do some things ahead of time so that we can make it easier on the developers and more attractive to them in terms of their responses and interest to really consider what they want to do on these sites. Here's a picture I took today. We actually had a sun break. This is looking to the property at the north with the highway on the left. The third property is in Nelscott, southeast 32nd Street, and I don't have an updated aerial yet. We don't have current flyover imagery, but you kind of get the idea. We bought this to realign the 32nd Street intersection, and so what we have left over is what we'll be offering for a development project. And this is what it looks like today. And the fourth property that's urban renewal is in Taft at the end of 51st Street. And it's about 1.7 acres. And here's a picture I took today of that property. And are there any questions on the urban renewal properties? Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, Madam Chair, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Mr. Ward. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's my understanding that Hostetler Park, I thought we were working with the tribe on that. Am I?
Yes, we did have meetings, a meeting with the tribe to talk about their interest, and they said that they are interested, but we weren't sure about their timing. So what we plan to do is notify them when the development offering goes out, so that they would have an opportunity to express their interest at that time.
So they'll be competing against another developer? I mean, my opinion on that, I don't know how the rest of the council feels. But there's a couple of pieces of property there. One is Hostetler Park, and the other is at the end of the old Hershey's place down on 51st. Those are really diamonds. The rest of them are useful, but these really are wonderful pieces of property. How are you doing that?
Yeah, I don't think they would necessarily be competing. I mean, if they came in, as you all have expressed an interest in partnering with them, if they came in, we would bring that forward to you as a separate point of conversation about the property.
Yeah, but what's to stop a 7-Eleven or something coming in there?
That's a great question. Mr. Chandler, do you have any other thoughts about that?
I think that as Allison and John go through this, you'll probably get some of those questions answered, because they're process questions, and that's what they're going to be discussing, is that process.
I mean, I would just hate to let Hostetler Park go because 7-Eleven, I'm just picking on them. They're nice business, I'm sure. But, you know, someone else gets in there because they paid $100,000 more, and then forever after we're going to be looking at a 7-Eleven rather than a interpretive center with bringing the city together with the tribe. There's other intrinsic values in there rather than how can we just get the most money.
Yeah, that's tough. When, when urban renewal does redevelopment, they're really trying to turn the property over to the tax rolls to help then boost the overall tax base. That's kind of the theory of the investment. I'd have to review my notes from the conversation, but it sounded to me, when you talk about an interpretive center, there are lots of different types of interpretive centers. It could be something from, a heritage walk to something, I can't remember the name of the city where they were referencing a very large-scale interpretive center that talks about and actually has different displays and is many acres of an experience of how Native American cultures used to live and foods they ate, and, basically gives you a very full 360-degree experience of what it was like at that time being part of a culture. So I think that it's tough to know what level of interest they will have, and when you get into larger facilities like that, you don't know. I mean, it's a lot of money for operations and maintenance of running a facility. So we didn't get a real good sense of what they might be interested in this time, but we did just have one conversation. So I'm sure as we go forward with this work, we'll have more information to share.
Madam Chair, part of the process tonight is to get your input as we are explaining how we are going forward, so that as you're looking at these properties, if we are going in a different direction, or you want to go into a different direction than what we're going to discuss, that's the purpose of this meeting. It's to explain that, to get your input into it, make modifications if we need to, because ultimately you will be the deciding body on how these properties develop.
Ultimately, I don't want to be a part of the council that is responsible for that's a circle K there.
What is some of them? Or
Yeah,
should-
on a pristine piece of property. I mean, those are our babies. You don't want to eat your babies, so.
Madam Chair, just to follow up with that conversation, if there is more desire to keep it as a park type or interpretive center type of thing, would that be something where the property would rather or should rather be a city property rather than an urban renewal? And then if so, then how would we do that? And maybe we need a more concerted effort talking with the tribe, because at least in the meeting that we had with them, the joint meeting earlier this year, there was interest on our, if the council had interest and their council had interest. And that wasn't the first conversation either. I mean, I believe the year before I heard that was also on the agenda and spoken of. And so anyway, I'm just saying, if it's not right for the urban renewal to keep that property for this pursuit, then perhaps we ought to have an asterisk next to it or something so we can continue talking about it.
Yeah, the decision's ultimately yours. So as Mr. Chandler mentioned, we can factor all of that feedback into the process for all of these properties.
So then maybe some of us who have interest in that, should meet with the tribe and find out a little bit more of how it would go if it does want to go that way. I'd be willing.
I'd like to hear your presentation.
Okay. And then just real quickly, wanted to run by the city properties that we are talking about also combining in the same development offering. Northeast 25th Street, which is just under 4 acres, which would be targeted to develop workforce housing. A property up on Northeast Reef Avenue, also with the intention of building workforce housing. And then Fernwood at the Villages, depending on timing with their master plan revision, might be possible to include that one. And then in D-Lake, the old Taft and Elscott D-Lake Fire Building, which could also be included in this offering. Okay. John, do you want to start your
Sure.
session?
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm really excited to be here with you tonight, and even the questions, I really want to speak to them. I think we kind of have an outline here, but I'm going to step back, particularly in light of the question. Allison's right. This is your decision, and you're in a really enviable position. When you control property, you get to control its fate. So rather than saying, let's just sell it to the highest bidder, whatever, if it's a 7-Eleven or a very mundane architecture apartment or something like that, you don't have to accept that. And in fact, I'm probably going to jump around here. This is going to be sort of stream of consciousness. what you do can really influence, I think, even, I don't think it's too much to say, the economy of Lincoln City and its future. The communities that I've worked with, both as an employee with the Portland Development Commission in the city of Hillsborough, then also as a consultant, typically they own properties, and as you say, at least in the case of two of these properties, maybe more, these are I'd say these are gems. And you don't want to just consign them to the first thing that comes through that pays some money, and you're done, but it doesn't really do anything for the city. In my experience, what this is about, when you control properties like this, is setting the stage, I think, for Lincoln City becoming a more successful place, a more economically prosperous place. And somewhere buried in my presentation, one of the things I sort of want to ask you is, what are your aspirations? It's not like you have to all answer that right now, but I presume that you want a successful city, a place that creates more job opportunities for your citizens, creates more housing opportunities, I think, for a range of incomes. And maybe you're trying, let me step back even further and say that in the communities I work with, I hope I'm not sounding too lyrical here, but in my experience, this is really about community pride. I want 10 or 20 years from now, when we look back at what we did in 2017 and 2018, say, we owned these properties, and we did this development offering, and we got some incredible things that really started to change the dynamic of Lincoln City. I'm going off my script here, but to me, it's most important to ask, why are you doing what you're doing? And so, for instance, the project in Baton Rouge, the location, I wish I had images, the next time I'd be happy to bring some. This is a stretch of Baton Rouge, kind of between a struggling older part of uptown and then downtown, and it's really derelict. And so this project we worked on has some old utility buildings, just incredible historic architecture, brick buildings, and with my assistance, went through a developer selection process, and I want to kind of walk you through that process and tell you why a particular approach that I strongly recommend I think is most effective. But in the case of Baton Rouge, we selected a developer who worked with a local African-American church to come up with a project that entailed restoring those buildings, bringing more housing, bringing entertainment, so helping to enliven this stretch. I'm trying to think of something analogous in Portland. It'd be a little bit like 82nd Avenue, if you know 82nd Avenue in Portland. They're really turning this area around. And so why I'm here, and I think why Allison and Ron brought me on board, Mr. Chandler, is to help really serve as a matchmaker, help you find developers for these sites that are going to turbocharge Lincoln City. And I don't want to presume too much. In saying that, if one could be concerned that if we're too successful, we create gentrification and displacement issues, and I'm well aware that you're aware that affordable housing, workforce housing, missing middle housing, those are issues that you, especially as the council or as the board, want to pay attention to. But so I'm a little bit disjointed, but I was struck by your question. The process that I want to describe now is intended to help you identify what are we really trying to achieve here. And let's find the right developers and uses that are going to help us get there. So this is not, if you're just going to put this out to see who would offer top dollars, you don't need to hire me. Just hire a real estate broker, and he or she will go out and market it. And if they're successful, then the 7-Eleven will offer more than this use over here or that, so sell it to 7-Eleven. But I'm pretty sure, I'm sensing, or that is not your intention. So stepping back, the process that I've used, both as an employee with the Portland Development Commission and then with the City of Hillsborough, and now I'm proposing, I've used it for a number of communities, mainly around Oregon, is called a request for expressions of interest. In this process, it's not intended to offer a real specific and narrow and, I'll say, rigid program where we say, okay, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for X units or X square feet of commercial or whatever. Instead, we're identifying, again, here are our broad purposes. We're trying to help to make this a more successful, livable community. We have these aspirations for Lincoln City. So we have these sites, Mr. or Ms. Developer. So tell us who you are and what you've done, and what are your ideas for this site? And so if someone says, for instance, on 51st, I'll make this up, although it's based on conversations I've been having with developers, that probably, I think you're going to get at least one serious hotel proposal for that. And I envision that as something, a pretty nice hotel with maybe a brew pub or a wine bar or some nice shops or something like that, something that helps make Taft, in that example, a cool community. It's already got great bones. There's a lot going on in Taft. I think of all the sites, that's one probably that gets me most excited. And in talking to developers, that's probably the one that they're most excited about. But in this process, rather than dictating a particular program, which to me is a little bit audacious for either staff or your consultant to say, we know what's best for the site. A developer may have a better idea. In Hillsborough, we had a property that it's about an acre site right on Main Street, and there was an old mid-century bank building, and we thought, well, we should tear down that bank building. Well, the developer said, I'm going to put a natural food grocery store there and then a new apartment building next to it. We came close enough to actually tearing down that building, and we would have missed this opportunity. So again, by doing a broader offering and saying, all right, Mr. Developer or Ms. Developer, here's what we're trying to achieve in downtown Hillsborough or in Taft or in Nelscott or whatever. Tell us who you are, what you've done, and what are your ideas for that site. And then we will, so if you have the most compelling story, the most compelling ideas, we'll select you, enter into an exclusive negotiating agreement, and over time we'll work out the details of the program and the design so that it achieves what we're hoping to achieve on that site. I kind of want to stop there. Does that approach make sense? Good. I know it's kind of like, it's a different approach, but I mean, it looks like, I'm picking up the vibe that it resonates as an approach. So what I'd be happy to do, I could walk you through the details of the process. Think very quickly. Should I keep going, or?
I don't know. Was there a question?
Well, I had a question. I'm sorry, I don't mean to dominate questions. Madam Chair, may I? One of the dangers on 51st Street is for it to become walled off from the sea. And I think in our Taft Village core, I'm just making stuff up here, we had at least a temporary ban on hotels in that area for that very reason of, you can go into communities, take a look into Depot Bay. You don't even see the ocean when you're driving through. And, that whole area not only consists of what is in the old Hershey's property, but that big parking space that's there. Right. And, who knows, maybe Moe's won't be there forever. So looking at your crystal ball, I think that we have to look at it a little bit differently than just one hotel over here being static. And most hotels, when they do around here, have little restaurants and stuff like that. They're in the hotel. Those hotels are there to do business. But you'd hate to lose the only flat place in town and the nice, ability to go clam hunting or whatever you call it, clam digging, and enjoy the natural environment, and just pasting up more hotels. I don't care how nice they are. So anyway, that's my opinion. I support you, but just that idea was.
Yeah, and, as Allison said, this is your decision. What I anticipate happening, and as an important aside, I've been talking with developers, and I'm getting a lot of interest. Now, at this stage, you could say talk is cheap, but sometimes I work with a city or whatever, and it's like, boy, it's pulling teeth to find I'm working with the City of Cornelia, sort of on a different project, but if and when we do a development offering there, it's like, that's going to be tough. City that's between Hillsborough and Forest Grove, it's a tough context. It doesn't happen to have an ocean by it. That helps. But we will issue this development offering with your blessing, and I'm anticipating that you can get any number of responses, and there's going to be a variety. And in fact, I think you're going to have a happily difficult decision. It's nice to be popular, and you're going to have, for any one of these sites, certainly for the 51st Avenue site, 3 or 4 or 5 responses, and they may be apples and oranges and bananas. One may be a hotel with a ground floor brew pub. Something else may be, might entail housing. Again, the nice thing about the request for expressions of interest, rather than RFP, rather than saying we want a hotel or we don't, whatever you say, it's going to be pretty rigid and inflexible. Instead, it's like, here's what we're trying to achieve. And part of my job, working with Allison and with Mr. Chandler, is to capture what your overarching goals are in this effort. And we'll be coming back to you in January with a draft where right now it's me talking and using this outline, but you're going to have a draft which really walks through what those goals are that you're trying to achieve. And I anticipate some of them will be common for all of these properties. Some of them will be more specific. What you're trying to achieve on First, right there at the Hostetler Park, that's a unique site. That's an incredible site. I agree with you, your earlier comment. But again, we want to identify our goals and then seek developers to come back and say, all right, I gather you want to achieve certain overarching principles for any one or all of these sites. Here's what I've done as a developer, and here's what I think would be the best fit for what you're trying to achieve, whether it's Hostetler or 15th or whatever. One of the things I always stress is that don't do a development offering if there's not developer interest, because there's 2 dangers with that. One is that you get no response, and then we will have wasted time and money. I think an even worse thing that can happen is someone comes in and submits something that falls far short, and I guess we're picking on the Southland Corporation tonight, but someone says, hey, I'll build a 7-Eleven there. What if that's the only response we get? I think that will be a disappointment. And so what I hope and anticipate, we won't issue this without a fair degree of certainty, which I really already have, that you're going to get developer responses who do quality projects, who will do thoughtful improvements, well-designed, that you'll all be proud of. And I want to come back to that. When success to me is going to be measured over time, 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, I expect people will look back and say that this effort back in 2017 and 2018 set the stage for Lincoln City becoming a better place. That's why I think we're here. That's what gets me up in the morning. There's some other aspects of this process that I wanted to walk you through, but I came here anticipating this to be a conversation, so I love questions, so please interrupt. One of the things that, a couple other important themes, and Allison, feel free to jump in if there's other things that I'm not addressing that should be addressed. One of them is, I'm sure you've heard the term public-private partnership, triple P. To me, that's probably going to be one defining aspect of this effort. And when I say public-private partnership, that could look like a lot of different things, but basically it means that there will be city or urban rural authority involvement in this project. So as for an example, if a developer came in and said, one developer said, sell me the land for its appraised value and I'll put up X, and X is a convenience store or whatever. Another developer may come in and say, I'll put in Y, which is a mixed-use project that brings housing and has some cool shops and things that, again, really up your game. But that project doesn't pencil, and I'll work with Ms. Robertson and Mr. Southgate and Mr. Chandler to demonstrate why there's not an adequate return on investment unless you cut me a deal. What does that look like? Well, is it a ground lease, or is it a discounted land sale price, or is there a tax abatement program? We're not committing to any of that at the outset, but in my template development offering, I always like to say, all right, here's the range of possible public sector tools that are potentially available. If you, Mr. and Ms. Developer, could show that your project is responsive to what we're trying to achieve, and if you could also show, however, that it needs some public assistance, maybe at least in the early years of the project, we are open to that. You're certainly not committing to it. In fact, even when you make your developer selection, that's just the beginning of the process. Let's say you select a developer, and I'll use the hotel example just as an example. You like their hotel, their schematic design, you like that developer's credentials and all that. Then we enter into an exclusive negotiating agreement, during which time we negotiate the full program, like how many hotel rooms, what sort of ground floor retail, let's look at the design, let's refine the design. We want a view corridor to the ocean, whatever those things are, we work through this thing. And then there's also a public investment in the project. Well, we're going to negotiate that as well. And we, the city, want an assurance, a reasonable assurance, that the long-term return on investment meets or exceeds our expectations. So I hasten to make this point. Even when you've made the developer selection for each of these sites, whether you go for all 8 or whatever, it's really a provisional selection subject to some months of negotiation. When you nail down the program, you nail down the design, you nail down what, if any, subsidy you are willing to entertain for the project. Another point, and I'm just going through my list here, the development code. In my experience, I've had the pleasure of meeting with Richard Townsend and Deborah Nicholson, and they're very helpful and on board. But I think they would agree, no zoning code, no development code is perfect. And so if someone comes in with a proposal for one of the sites that we really like, and you select that developer, but over time, you may conclude with the developer and with Allison and myself that, okay, these 2 or 3 zoning code provisions are really a barrier to what we want built. We love this building, but our zoning code is in the way. And I can tell you, I've never worked with a code that didn't have flaws. And it's not for lack of goodwill, but zoning codes can become obsolete or based on old thinking. I mean, I'll take as an example, and this may be controversial, but sometimes parking requirements, minimum parking requirements are so high that they are an impediment to getting a project that you otherwise would be very supportive of. So I'm sort of telegraphing elements that you'll see when we come back in January with the draft development offering for your review. You'll see language about, look, any developer would prefer to work within the existing zoning code because it's going to be more work and more time and more risk not to meet the code. But if there are aspects of the development code that are particularly problematic, and if you agree, and it's your decision ultimately, I want to be able to convey to developers, we are open to having that conversation. We're not going to concede at the outset that you can, whatever codes you don't like, we'll get rid of. I would never advise that, but I will urge you to be open if there's a code that is in the way of a great project. I'll do my best to try to convince you of why I think you should reconsider that particular code. I could get into the details of our marketing efforts. I'm somewhat conscious of the time. I think the main thing I want to convey is I commend you for your willingness even to listen to me waxing on about my recommended process, your openness to being flexible, to seeing what developers might come in. It's going to be really important, again, for you to review the work we do in the next couple months. Are we correctly capturing the aspirations that you have for these sites? Because that's going to be an important signal to the developers. I want to stress you have developer interests, and the developers I'm talking to are quality people. They're not hacks who are just going to build something cheap, then flip it. A year later, they're gone, and then when it starts having problems 10 years from now, it's like, well, that guy's long gone. These are the developers I work with. I think to a person are long-term hold. So they want to build quality because if they don't, they're going to pay for it with excessive maintenance costs. Their interest in Lincoln City, I think, is something that you should be proud of and you should be excited about. I hope you are. I believe when we do this development offering, we're going to get some great responses from great developers. And again, we're going to look back at some point in the future and say, I was on the council, I was on the staff back when those seminal projects that really started to change and improve Lincoln City's identity were built. I hope that makes sense.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Anderson.
John, I like what you're saying so far. I guess the question I have of developers, as they look at, and you kind of lay out these individual properties to them, other than 51st, they're all relatively small.
Yes.
And isolated. On the surface, it looks, like there's not a lot of expansion room. So the question I would have is there discussion or opportunity to help potential developers see other adjoining or nearby development opportunities that might somehow tie into this? If I can, and not, I don't know, picking on the First Street property, narrow, along 101, got wetlands and all this stuff. But, not too far north of it is some empty land also along 101, and it moves off. I'm just trying to think, does a developer perhaps look at both sites with maybe a bigger project or a project that ties together? Some in their mind, certainly not mine, but the other, if I can, 15th Street is a classic because it's so already built up around there, but yet to the south of 15th, southeast corner of that intersection, is a knoll that reaches to the 14th Street, empty, owned by somebody other than Urban Renewal. But is there a way to kind of bridge 15th Street and 15th Street might end up being a parking lot, for example, but they see vision on that other piece of property. It's not even for sale, but, I'm just trying to get inside the developer's head, and can you help them see that you don't come to Lincoln City just to do that one block or that one lot on 15th Street, that there's bigger opportunities there?
Yes. My one-word answer is yes. I think developers, in my experience, are going to look for other opportunities. Now, ideally, if you have the resources, which I assume you don't, to go and tie up other properties or even get options, that's something that would be optimal.
Sure.
But I'm not sure it's necessary. And I think I want to take your question and kind of pivot a little bit to say that the fact that you have as many as 8 properties, and I guess we're not definitive, but most or all of the 8 properties, the 4 urban renewal properties, and then the 4 city-owned properties that Allison showed a few minutes ago, that I'm not answering your question, but it's a variation on it. The fact that you have these 8 properties, I think, is one of the reasons why we're finding that there's developer interest. If you had, say, the 15th Street property and that was it, I'd almost probably say just put it on the market. And if you want, specify what you want to some degree. But when you have 8 properties, in my experience, and maybe this is what your question is getting at, but developers, they want to build on their success. So, for instance, Clyde Holland, I'm sure you know Clyde, in Orenco has developed probably about 1,000 units in about 8 buildings. Would he have done a single building of 200-some units? Maybe, but I think there's such an economy of effort on his part. And so I think that's what we're going to find. The developers I'm talking to are intrigued because, well, I could do this project over here, but there's these other couple properties. On top of that, and I've seen this happen, they may opt to approach the property owner over here, so without our ever touching it. Just to name it, you probably know Roy Kim, who developed in Central Bethany, who's now doing an incredible project in Rockwood and Gresham, with which the mayor's probably familiar, the old Fred Meyer there. He bought a nearby 2-acre parcel. The city owns about a 6-acre parcel. He also bought a 2-acre parcel because he has enough confidence in himself as a developer and in the city as a partner that I want to do more. So just these observations, I would say resonate with your observation that there's more to leverage. And in fact, I think one of the reasons we do this is to leverage more investment. The projects I've worked on are not intended to be standalone projects. We invest in them because we hope that they're going to stimulate further development.
I'm looking at the discussion points on the memo we received. You've listed prevailing wage. What control do we have over
Yeah.
prevailing wage?
This is, thank you for asking. This is a big driver in the success of these projects. So you're all familiar with prevailing wage. Basically, if there's a public works, or whether it's a school or a city hall or a road, Oregon law requires that be built using prevailing wage. So pay union wage. You don't necessarily have to hire union workers, but you have to pay those wages, which depend on what part of Oregon you're in. So it's localized to a degree. The challenge is that that can sometimes add 15 or 20% to the cost of a project. And I think we're probably going to be talking about projects that are going to be difficult enough to pencil without that additional requirement. So I always put this here because in my experience, it's a driver in the negotiations. If there is public involvement in a private, if you sell a property to someone and he or she develops it, and it's a great project and you selected them sometime in 2018, and they don't ask for or receive any public involvement, then they just do a private deal. If there's public investment in the project, depending on the level and the type of public investment, that could trigger BOLI, so prevailing wage. And again, that's probably going to be a deal killer. And so as we move forward, we'll want to pay attention to what type and level of subsidy you might invest. Now, the fact is, my impression is there's limited resources, so we may not encounter that challenge here. But if there's a land write-down, or if there's assistance with SDCs or tax abatement, those types of subsidies generally don't trigger prevailing wage. If you actually wrote a check for over $750,000, that would trigger prevailing wage. Now, I'm assuming that's unlikely, and so, but it's something that, in my experience, in the deals I've worked with in Oregon, it's a huge factor, some of them.
Would a ground lease trigger prevailing wage?
That is a great question, because the law is silent on that. The law says if there's a land sale that is a write-down, depending on some getting into the weeds, I'll spare you, but a land write-down doesn't necessarily trigger prevailing wage. It doesn't speak to a ground lease, and so that's actually something that makes me a little bit nervous, because I didn't even say this earlier. With the request for expressions of interest, in addition to being flexible on program and design and saying, you tell us, Mr. and Ms. Developer, how responsive you are to what we want to achieve in Lincoln City. But I also advertise flexibility on the deal structure. You may want to just sell the property in a purchase and sale agreement at market value or some discount based on your belief that over time it'll pay for itself. You may do a ground lease, you may do a lease with the option to purchase. But if there's a ground lease, we would want to know going in if that risks triggering prevailing wage. And we could do that. To their credit, BOLI is really good about doing predetermination letters, where we write a letter, certainly with the assistance of your attorney, stating here's the project, here's the deal terms, here's our subsidy. As we read the law, we do not believe we're subject to prevailing wage. Please confirm. And then it's up to BOLI. But you ask a great question, because it's I don't think that question has ever been posed to them. So it's actually a gray area about ground lease, especially if it's a discounted ground lease rate. I'll tell you an example of how, again, these are just examples. They're kind of getting in the weeds. In Rockwood, are any of you familiar with Rockwood in Gresham? It's a tough area.
Didn't used to be.
It didn't used to be.
Used to be a very nice area.
It's declined in the last, I'd say, 20 years or so. So the old Fred Meyer there was, the city bought it 15 years ago, tore down the Fred Meyer eventually, and then they did development offering. It's a long story, but because the property, because the project would never pencil on its own, the city, one of the things they're doing to make the project pencil is to ground lease it, but at an initial rate that's well below market. In fact, don't quote me, but I think it's like $1 a year for the first X years. And then in year whatever, it starts to escalate up until it's at market rate. Now, even with that discounted ground lease in the front years, the net present value of the tax revenues from that, and the revenues to the Urban Renewal Authority are going to far exceed if they just sold it for today's appraised value. So when we get to this point, and forgive me, I'm really getting into the weeds of specific examples, but the point I'm going to make for your question is there's real question about whether that is subject to prevailing wage, and in fact, I think they probably are going to be subject to it.
Also on this list is inclusion of city-owned housing sites.
Yeah, I don't know if Mr. Chandler.
Have you spoken with Mr. Chandler about that?
We have. So we're going to talk a little bit more of that during the city council meeting.
Okay.
But that was the whole idea behind all of these properties that we're talking about. And instead of just doing the commercial properties, of also tapping into Mr. Southgate's expertise for our residential properties as well. And those would be the two lots just above the Episcopalian Church and then Fernwood.
So you're referring to the undeveloped housing sites,
Yes.
not the sites that we already have houses on?
No, it's the undeveloped sites.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Anderson, did you have something?
I'm good.
What is the prevailing wage right now?
Well, it depends on the trade. So the state keeps data regarding what, plumbers are paid and or plumbing apprentices and all the different trades, and they fluctuate based on the trade, but also on the part of the state you're talking about. So those statistics are available. I think they're updated like quarterly. And as you probably know, they're going up. Construction prices have been going up precipitously ever since we came roaring out of the recession from 2008, 2009.
As an item of interest, the building you're in now was hit with prevailing wage after the person had built it. One of the workers complained that they'd used federal money and didn't meet the wage requirement, and hence now the city has it. So.
Yeah, Hillsborough had to deal with this as well of a project they did. You do not want to be in that position. You want to know, obviously, going in, if you're subject to the law. That's why I always counsel, unless it's clearly not subject to it, get a predetermination letter, find out from BOLI, get them on record saying, yes, we agree with your interpretation going in, so before you start the construction.
Madam Chair, I wonder if we could get a feel for next steps and kind of timing with those next steps, because it's starting to rain now, so we want to catch those sun breaks for the developer in June.
Yeah, I'd say we're in the marketing phase and talking to developers. In fact, we're going to have another developer down from Oregon City tomorrow. He's doing some interesting work there in Oregon City. The idea is to issue the offering in January, so we'd come back at probably your first January meeting with a 90% draft of this offering, and hopefully come out of that meeting with, okay, this is good, or please change this section or whatever, tweak this or that.
Now, the offering is that
Request for
expressions of
interest.
or
Right.
Okay.
So we'd issue that. We'd have a deadline, probably 4 or 5, 6 weeks. So let's give ourselves a little bit of wiggle room. Sometime in March, we would get responses for some or all of these sites, and we then go through developer selection process. Depending on the complexity of the project and how easily or difficultly the negotiations go, we could have summer 2018 construction. So part of that's going to be up to all of us collectively. If someone proposes something that's a stretch and we have to really work through it, or there's significant changes to the development code, which is why a developer is going to want to try to meet your code if he or she can, but if it's going to flat out need the development code modifications, it probably would be asking your staff, your planning staff, a lot to say, all right, in the next 20 minutes, please change these 3 things in our code. To me, it's quite possible, especially on the simpler sites, to be under construct, to be in the ground in 2018.
So if I can revert back to Councilor Ward's earlier questions and concerns, I like the idea of the request for interest, because it's well beyond our scope of ideas and creativity. But when those come in, as we're looking at them, that would be the time, so that's the question, that would be the time that, to pick on 7-Eleven, gets thrown out and the art Ferris wheel goes in, because we like that? Would that be, is that the point where kind of a screening
Yes.
of visions and ideas take place?
Right. So that, in fact, we just went through this process in Talent, a very similar process, Talent, Oregon, just outside of Ashland, 2 weeks ago, selected a developer, and we had 3 great responses on, is a single site, so it's a lot simpler development offering than Lincoln City, but the developer who was selected had passion and vision and had some great ideas for these sites. Now, one of the nice things about this process is RFP typically requires that you as the developer spend a lot of money on architects and do a lot of number crunching, say, all right, I could build 73 units over 4,700 square feet to read all that, something very specific. With this, it's more about, who you are, what you've done, and what are your ideas. So your idea is to build a Ferris wheel. How did you describe it? The Arts Center Ferris, whatever it is. And so, yes, you'll make that decision in March, late March, the interview process. Typically, you'll shortlist. But now, at the very outset, you will have selected developer X because you love his ideas, you love his experience in 7 other cities in Oregon and Washington and whatever. It's not going to be a blind date, and but it's also going to have enough flexibility. And this developer in Talent, they like him and his ideas. There's a couple things they want to see changed, or there's a particular type of subsidy he's requesting, saying, if you want that subsidy, here's what we're going to expect of you in return. So, for instance, he's asking for a land write-down, basically give me a deep discount on the land because I want to build some missing middle workforce ownership housing. And so their requirement there is, okay, we'll consider that. We just selected you, so we're not going to commit to it, but we're open to that. But we want a long-term affordability provision. We don't want someone to buy that unit for $175,000 and then 2 years later flip it for $300 because that's where the market really is. So those are the sort of conversations you get to control.
That's true. I guess the other part of that is are developers who didn't win the dance contest angry at the city because they weren't picked? And I think what you said, because of this interest request, it's not a lot of expense, that they probably aren't, but I'd like to hear it from you.
That's a great observation. Because, yeah, if I spend $50,000 responding to something and I don't get it, and I thought, man, I'm at least as good, and there's something about the other developer that the people in the city council didn't see, whatever. But if I've instead, in fact, the developer, the main competition in Talent, we had a great chat the next day or two, and no one likes to lose, but I mean, this guy's a friend. I mean, I've only met him through this process, but he's, it's civil, and yeah, I'd feel different if the process that we used had made him incur a lot of money and all that, but instead it's like, okay, I gave it my best shot. In Baton Rouge, we had 8 people submit. 1 only was selected. The other 6 were philosophical. 1 was upset, but he was I think, the outlier, seriously. And a lot of it is communication between Alice and myself. When we make the calls the next day, say, okay, I'm sorry, it was a tough competition, you did a great shot, but the council has selected this other team to work with. And we also hold out, it would not be unheard of to say, you know what, we didn't get across the finish line with Developer X, are you still interested? And so a developer would be foolish to totally offend Allison or myself if there's a chance that, and there will be other opportunities. Again, if we're successful, other development is going to ensue from this.
Thank you.
Madam Chair. I just have a follow-up question to something you just mentioned a minute ago, which is the people who would have these ideas and want to bring them forward, would one of the criteria be that they bring to us or you bring for them, if you're deciding between 2 or 3 or more, wouldn't that be something? There are other pieces of work that they've done that we could assess their approach to their work and that type of thing.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And in my template, the offering that I use and that we'll be drafting for your review in January, we say just that. We want to see what is your experience. This is not flying blind. And if someone hasn't done anything, that's going to be pretty serious. That's going to be a deterrent to that person being selected. And the developers that, between Alice and myself, that we've been talking with, every one of them has done, I would say, quality projects somewhere within 100 miles of where we're sitting.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation. I look forward to continued discussion during our city council meeting.
Thank you, yeah.
Any further agency member comments?
Madam Chair, just wanted to apologize for blurting out there without seeking permission of the chair. Rockwood's a sore thumb for me.
That's all right, that's all
I
right.
used to love that area.
This is a discussion.
Oh, my wife grew up there. It's really sad how it's changed.
All right, I will adjourn the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank
I'll be
you.
back.
See you next hour.